The smell of the rendering plant reached the county road before the building itself came into view, a low gray structure crouched behind chain link and dead grass on the edge of town. Most folks drove past it with their windows up, noses wrinkled, never giving it a second thought beyond the nuisance of it. He was not most folks. Every Tuesday and Friday, just after dawn, his rusted-out pickup rattled into the gravel lot behind the plant, the same time the workers wheeled out the burn barrels, loaded with bone scraps and fat trimmings nobody wanted. Cattle bones, hog joints, trimmed fat too poor even for the tallow buyers, the stuff that got dumped and set alight because it cost more to haul than it was worth to keep. He'd back the truck up, lower the tailgate, and start loading 5-gallon buckets like a man loading ammunition, careful and unhurried, while younger men in stained aprons leaned on the fence and watched. They called him the Bone Man before he'd said 10 words to any of them. It started as a joke between shifts, then became something the whole crew repeated without thinking twice. Old Sam, out there again, hauling off what the fire was built to eat. Nobody asked him why. It seemed obvious enough, an old widower with too much time and too little sense, filling his truck bed with garbage because garbage was free and he had nothing better to do with his mornings. He never corrected them. He never explained that he'd learned to see food in things other men saw as refuse, learned it in places where waste wasn't a choice you got to make, where a bone with any marrow left in it was a meal somebody hadn't eaten yet. He'd carry that lesson home from wherever he'd been and never speak of it, not to the plant workers, not to his neighbors, not even to himself most days. It just lived in his hands, in the careful way he sorted through a bucket of scraps like he was checking a man's pulse. Back at the farm, the buckets went into the barn, into a corner he'd cleared out and scrubbed clean, where 2 enormous pots sat over low fires he tended through the night, like a man keeping watch. He'd learned that patience mattered more than heat, that a broth built slow held something a fast one never could. The neighbors noticed the smoke first, then the smell drifting across the fence line, and it wasn't long before the complaints started. A phone call here, a letter to the county office there, a young rancher 2 farms over telling anyone who'd listen that the old man had finally lost his mind, living off what the rendering plant paid good money to burn. He kept the fires going anyway, stirring slow, tasting nothing yet, waiting on something he couldn't yet prove was coming. The complaint that finally got the county man out to the farm came typed on letterhead, folded twice, delivered by a deputy who looked more embarrassed than official standing there at the gate with his hat in his hand. He said the young rancher had gone down to the office himself, said the smoke was affecting his cattle, said the smell carried clean across 2 properties and into town on a south wind. The old man listened without arguing, walked the deputy back to the barn, lifted the lid off one of the pots so the steam rolled out warm and thick, carrying something that smelled less like waste and more like a kitchen on a cold morning. The deputy stood there a long moment, quiet, before saying he didn't smell anything a man could rightly complain about, and that maybe folks were complaining about something else entirely. He didn't write anything down. He tipped his hat and left, and word of that visit spread through town faster than the smoke ever had. Still, the talk didn't stop. At the feed store, men leaned against the counter and joked about buying stock in bone broth, laughing loud enough for it to carry out to the parking lot where he loaded sacks into his truck bed, saying nothing, letting the words roll past him the way rain rolled off an old tin roof. He'd heard worse in worse places. He'd learned a long time ago that a man could survive being laughed at so long as he didn't need anyone's permission to keep working. What he needed was time and patience and the low, steady heat that turned tendon and marrow into something worth drinking, something that could put weight back on a starving man in a week when nothing else could. Nights blurred into each other. He'd sit on an overturned crate by the fire with a thermos of black coffee, watching the surface of the broth ripple slow, skimming the foam with an old tin ladle he'd carried home from somewhere far away, and never once explained to anyone who asked. The barn smelled of wood smoke and simmered bone, and some nights the smell reminded him of things he didn't let himself think about in daylight: mess tents, hollow-eyed men, broth stretched thin to feed 20 when there was only enough for 10. He'd learned then that flavor could come later. First, a man needed to survive the night. He carried that lesson into every pot he built now, layering scraps and marrow and patience, the way he once layered whatever scraps of hope he could find for men who had none left. By the third week, the broth had turned dark and rich, clinging to the ladle like something alive, and still he hadn't let a single drop past his own lips. He wanted a stranger's mouth to tell him the truth first. Someone with nothing to prove, nothing to protect. No memory of who he used to be before the war made him careful with everything, even food. The frost came early that year, settling on the barn roof like a warning nobody bothered to read. He kept working through it, hauling water before dawn, feeding the fire through the coldest hours because a broth left untended would skin over and lose whatever it had gained in the night. His knees complained louder in that weather, an old ache that had followed him home decades before and never fully left, but he'd learned to carry pain the way he carried buckets, steady, without complaint, setting it down only when the work was done. The rendering plant workers had stopped snickering by then, mostly because he'd stopped giving them anything to laugh at. He came in quiet, loaded his buckets, paid his few dollars for what they'd have burned anyway, and left before anyone could needle him into an argument he had no interest in winning. But word traveled the way it always did in small towns, passed along counters and over fences, and soon the diner regulars had a name for him that wasn't unkind so much as careless. The Bone Man, they called him, like it summed up everything he was now that his wife was gone and his fields had gone quiet. He didn't correct them. Names had never much bothered him. He'd been called worse by men he respected more. What did bother him some nights was the doubt that crept in when the fire burned low and the dark pressed against the barn walls. He'd stir the broth and wonder if he was chasing a memory instead of a purpose, trying to recreate something that only made sense in a place stripped down to hunger and grief. Maybe good broth wasn't a magic trick a man could perform twice. Maybe some things belonged only to the moment that made them necessary. Then he'd taste the steam rising off the pot, not the broth itself, never that, but the smell of it filling the cold air, and something in his chest would settle, the way it used to when he heard boots falling into rhythm on hard ground. It told him to keep going, even if it couldn't yet tell him why. By the fourth week, the barrels along the wall had multiplied past what any sensible man would keep for himself. He labeled them in grease pencil, dated each batch, adjusted the salt, adjusted the time, chasing something he couldn't yet name, but recognized instantly whenever it slipped away from him. His neighbor's wife complained about the smell drifting over the fence line on windy evenings, and word of that complaint reached town faster than any compliment ever could have. He heard about it second-hand at the feed store, standing near the door with a sack of onions under one arm, saying nothing, letting the men behind the counter enjoy their laughter while he counted, in his own quiet way, exactly how many more nights the broth needed before it would be ready for a stranger's mouth to judge. The onion sack stayed under his arm the whole ride home, and he set it on the porch step without much thought, his mind still turning over the sound of that laughter, the way it had rolled through the feed store like something men were proud to share. He didn't blame them. A man who'd never smelled hunger the way he had wouldn't understand why a pot of bones mattered enough to keep a widower up past midnight, stirring in the cold with a coat buttoned to his chin. He'd learned long ago that explanations rarely changed a mocking mind. Only results did, and results took time nobody in that store seemed willing to give him. That evening he went back to the barn earlier than usual, before the light had fully drained from the sky, and stood over the largest pot with his hands resting on the rim, feeling the warmth climb into his palms. He'd started adding a bay leaf from a jar his late wife had kept on the windowsill for 30 years, untouched until now. Its glass fogged with dust he'd wiped away with his sleeve. It felt strange, using something of hers for a project she never would have understood, yet he liked to think she would have approved of anything that kept a man busy and useful instead of hollow and idle. He skimmed the surface with an old tin ladle, watching the fat rise and fall in slow circles, patient as a man waiting out weather. Behind him the barn creaked in the wind, and somewhere down the fence line a dog barked twice and went quiet. He thought of the mess hall smell that used to hang over cold mornings overseas, how the men complained about the food but lined up for it anyway, how nourishment mattered more than pride when the stomach demanded honesty. That memory alone kept his spine straight through the neighbors' complaints, through the snickering at the store, through the slow ache in his knees that no liniment fully eased anymore. By the 5th week, he began keeping a small notebook, its pages soft from handling, where he wrote down each adjustment in tight, careful print. More marrow, less salt, longer simmer, shorter simmer, a splash of vinegar to draw out what hid in the joints. He didn't know exactly what he was aiming for, only that he'd recognize it the moment it arrived, the way a man recognizes the particular quiet before dawn breaks over a ridge. Some nights he sat on an overturned bucket beside the fire, staring at the reflection of flame on the pot's dark side, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, not hope exactly, but its quieter cousin, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles into the bones and waits. He didn't know yet that a woman from 3 counties over, driving a beat-up delivery van with a diner's name stenciled on the side, would soon pull into the feed store parking lot, chasing a rumor she couldn't quite explain either. The rain came sideways that Tuesday, the kind that turned the county road to soup, and sent most sensible men indoors. He was not a sensible man that morning, not by the town's measure, standing in the open barn doorway watching water sheet off the tin roof, while the pot inside simmered low and steady, undisturbed by the weather outside. He'd learned that trick decades ago, how a fire could hold its temper even when the sky didn't, how patience was mostly a matter of ignoring what the world was doing around you and tending only to what was in front of you. The broth that day was different. He knew it before he tasted it, could tell by the color, a deep amber gone almost mahogany at the edges, by the way it clung to the wooden spoon instead of running off it. He ladled a small cup, let it cool on the porch rail, and drank it slow, eyes closed, the way his sergeant used to test water, before letting the young ones near it. It was right. Not almost right. Right. He didn't celebrate. There was no fist in the air, no phone call to make, no one waiting on the other end of a line to hear it anyway. He simply wrote the measurements down in his notebook, underlined them twice, and set a jar aside in the icebox, like a man setting aside a photograph he intended to look at again. The next morning he loaded 4 jars into the truck bed alongside the usual buckets, said nothing to the rendering plant workers who watched him pass with the same tired amusement they always wore, and drove into town with the heater rattling and his knees aching from the damp. At the feed store, the regulars were arguing about seed prices near the counter, paying him no more mind than they had in weeks past. He set 1 jar on the counter without ceremony, the way another man might set down a paper to be read later, and asked the clerk if he'd mind trying it sometime. No rush. The clerk, more out of politeness than curiosity, unscrewed the lid right there, and took a sip standing at the register. His eyebrows lifted. He didn't say much, just looked at the jar, then at the old man, then back at the jar, like he was recalculating something he'd assumed was settled. Outside, unnoticed by either of them, a dented van eased into the gravel lot, its tires cutting fresh tracks through the mud, a faded diner name half peeled from its side panel. The engine ticked as it cooled. The woman behind the wheel sat a moment longer than necessary, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at the store's fogged glass, trying to place why she'd driven 2 hours on a rumor that made no sense on paper. An old veteran, some scraps, a smell folks couldn't stop talking about 3 counties over. The clerk set the jar down slower than he'd picked it up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and for a moment nobody near the counter noticed anything had changed. The men arguing about seed prices kept arguing. The rain kept ticking against the tin awning outside. But something had shifted in the small space between the clerk and the old man, a kind of recalibration neither of them announced out loud. The woman in the van stayed put a while longer, watching the store through water-streaked glass, gathering whatever nerve had gotten thin over 2 hours of driving on nothing but a name and a rumor. She'd heard about it from a trucker who ate at her counter twice a week, a man who didn't get worked up over food easily, who'd gone quiet describing something he'd tasted at a roadside stand 3 counties over. Broth, he'd called it, though he said the word like it didn't quite cover what he meant. She ran a diner that had survived on grit and low margins for 11 years, and she'd learned not to chase every story that came through on a trucker's breath. But this one had followed her home, sat with her through supper, kept her up half the night doing arithmetic she couldn't finish. She pushed open the van door and stepped into the mud, pulling her collar up against the rain, and crossed the lot toward the fogged glass with the particular caution of someone who half expected to be disappointed. Inside, the old man had already turned to go, his boots leaving damp prints across the worn floorboards, his coat collar dark with rain he hadn't bothered to shake off. He didn't see her yet. He was thinking about the pots waiting behind the barn, about the bones simmering low and slow the way he'd learned to keep something going with almost nothing, about the hours a man could stretch out of patience if he just refused to rush what needed time. The bell over the door gave its thin metallic complaint as she pushed through, and the clerk looked up, still holding the jar like it might explain itself further if he waited long enough. She didn't waste time on the seed price men or the shelves of feed sacks stacked to the ceiling. Her eyes went straight to the jar on the counter, then to the old man crossing toward the door, his shoulders set the way a man's are when he expects nothing and asks for less. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice carried more than the words themselves, carried the 2 hours of driving, the trucker's strange reverence, the 11 years of learning what real food tasted like versus what people settled for. "Is that yours?" He stopped, one hand already on the door, rain drumming steady on the tin roof above them, and turned to face a stranger who'd driven through weather like this for something most of the county had laughed at. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and that was all, because he'd learned long ago that a man who explains himself before he's asked has already lost some ground he didn't need to give away. She studied him a moment, rain still ticking off the brim of her coat where she hadn't bothered to shake it dry, and something in her face was doing arithmetic he couldn't follow yet. The clerk set the jar down like it had grown heavier in his hands, and the 2 seed price men by the counter had gone quiet in that particular way. Men go quiet when they sense they're about to be wrong about something they'd already decided. "I run a diner 2 counties over," she said. "Truckers stop for coffee and stay for whatever's simmering. One of my regulars brought me a mason jar he swore was better than anything I'd made in 11 years, and I told him he was drunk or lying." She paused, glancing again at the jar, at the old man's boots leaving wet prints on the boards, at the coat that had seen better decades. He wasn't lying. The old man didn't say anything to that. He'd never been a man who needed his work praised out loud to know it was good. He'd learned that in places where the only reward for a job done right was staying alive long enough to do another one. But something in his chest loosened anyway, quiet as a held breath finally let go. "I want to know where it comes from," she said. "I want to know if you can make more." The clerk opened his mouth, maybe to warn her, maybe to explain the smell complaints and the rendering plant, and the boy who called him senile at the feed store not 2 weeks back. But the old man spoke first, plain as reading off a label. "Comes from bones nobody wanted. Fat trimmings they were fixing to burn. I don't waste what still has good in it." He said it the way he'd say the weather was turning. No defense in it, no apology, just fact, laid flat on the counter next to the jar. She looked at him for a long moment, rain still falling steady outside, the tin roof drumming its patient rhythm, and whatever she'd expected to find at the end of a 2-hour drive through bad weather, it apparently wasn't a soft-spoken old man in a worn coat with mud on his boots and no interest in convincing her of anything. "I want to buy it," she said. "Not a jar, barrels. As much as you can make." The seed price men exchanged a look. Neither of them tried very hard to hide, and the clerk's hand had gone still on the counter, like he was watching a hand of cards turn over that he hadn't dealt. Sam set the jar back on the counter, careful, the way a man sets down something he doesn't want to spill even after it's already sealed. "Barrels," he said, not quite a question, more a word he was turning over to see if it fit anywhere in his life. He hadn't heard that word applied to his broth since the mess tent, when barrels meant feeding men who hadn't eaten in 2 days and needed something warm before anything else could matter. It wasn't a word he expected to hear again, standing in a feed store with rain coming down, outside, and a woman in a canvas coat looking at him like he'd handed her something she'd been hunting for a long while. "I've got a diner," she said. "2, actually. One here in the county, one 40 miles east. I go through good stock like most places go through flour. What I bought last spring wasn't fit to call stock. Watered down, gray, no body to it. I stopped buying it and started making do, and making do's been costing me customers who know the difference." She tapped the jar lid with one finger. "This has body. This has time in it. I can taste the hours." The clerk cleared his throat, like he wanted to say something about the smell complaints, about the rendering plant, about the things people had been saying at the counter for weeks. But the woman didn't look at him, and Sam didn't either. He'd learned a long time ago that you didn't answer noise you hadn't been asked to answer. "I don't have barrels sitting ready," he said. "I make what the day allows. Bones cool, fat renders slow, and slow's the only speed I trust it to." "I'm not asking for tomorrow," she said. "I'm asking if you'll make it for me regular. I'll pay for the barrels, pay for the bones if the plant charges you, pay for your time driving it out. I'm not interested in a sample. I'm interested in a supply." Outside, the rain had eased into something quieter, a mist more than a downpour, and through the window Sam could see his old truck sitting in the gravel lot, mud splashed to the fenders, looking like it belonged more to a scrapyard than a delivery route. He thought about the rendering plant men who called him the Bone Man, like it was something to laugh about behind their gloved hands. He thought about the neighbor who'd complained twice to the county about the smell drifting off his land. He thought about broken tools he'd saved, and pigs nobody wanted, and how many times in his life someone had looked at what he kept and seen only what they'd already thrown away. "I'll need drums," he said finally. "Clean ones, and time to build up to it proper." "Take the time," she said. "I've got nowhere else that tastes like this." They shook hands across the counter, hers small and quick, his broad and slow, the kind of handshake that had sealed cattle deals and land leases back when a man's word still meant something on its own. She wrote her number on a napkin, the ink bleeding slightly where the paper had gone damp from the coffee cups stacked nearby, and told him to call collect if he needed to, that she'd rather pay the operator than miss a batch. He folded the napkin into his shirt pocket, the way he used to fold orders overseas, careful, like it mattered more than the words written on it. He drove home slower than usual, the mist turning the fields silver gray, the ditches running full along the county road. He kept glancing at the passenger seat where the empty mason jar sat, rinsed clean, catching what little light there was. It seemed a small thing to have started all this, a jar of broth handed across a folding table at a feed store, but he'd learned long ago that small things were usually the ones that mattered, the ones men overlooked because they were too busy watching for something bigger. Back at the farm, he unloaded nothing that day, just sat a while in the cab with the engine ticking as it cooled, looking at the barn where the drums would need to go, where the fire pit would need widening if he was going to keep pace with a woman who wanted supply instead of samples. He thought about the plant men and their gloved hands, and the way they'd laughed when he first started hauling off their scraps, calling him fool and worse. He thought about how quiet mockery could get once money started changing hands, how quickly men forgot their jokes when there was a profit to be had. That night, he wrote in the ledger he kept by the wood stove, the same ledger he'd used for feed costs and vet bills for 30 years, and under a new heading, he wrote her name and the word barrels, and beside it, a question mark he meant to erase once the first delivery went through clean. He didn't sleep easy, not from worry exactly, but from the old habit of running numbers and logistics through his head, the way he used to plan supply lines, counting drums and driving time, and how many pots he'd need going at once, if this was going to be steady instead of occasional. The rain stopped sometime before dawn, and when he stepped outside to check the fire pit, the sky was clearing pink at the edges, and the far pasture smelled of wet grass and wood smoke, and for the first time in a long while he felt like a man with somewhere to be. The delivery came 3 days later, an old flatbed truck with wooden barrels lashed down under a tarp, and the diner owner climbed out wearing a canvas coat too thin for the morning chill, her breath fogging as she shook his hand like they were closing on land instead of soup. She'd driven 2 counties over on the strength of a paper cup and a promise, and she said so plainly, standing in his yard with the mud sucking at her boots, telling him she'd already told her cook to clear shelf space, already told her regulars something new was coming. And he didn't say much back. He never did, when praise came directly at him instead of sideways through gossip. He just nodded and showed her where the pots would go, how the fire pit worked, how he skimmed the fat and strained through cheesecloth twice before anything touched a jar. She watched him work with the attention of someone taking notes she'd never write down, and when he finally ladled a sample into a tin cup for her, she closed her eyes the same way she had at the feed store, like she was listening to something instead of tasting it. Word moved through the county the way it always did, faster than any radio bulletin, carried on grocery store lines and church steps and the benches outside the barber shop. People who'd laughed at him hauling scrap now found reasons to drive past his farm slower, craning to see the barrels stacked by the barn, the smoke curling steady from the pit, from dawn until dusk. Some stopped to ask questions they dressed up as neighborly concern, really just fishing for numbers, wanting to know what the diner was paying, wanting to know if he'd take on more scraps if they had them. He answered plainly, without triumph, the same tone he'd have used discussing weather or feed prices, because gloating wasn't in him, and never had been. But he noticed the shift all the same, how the rancher who'd spread rumors about him going senile now avoided the feed store on days Sam was likely to be there, how the plant workers who'd called him the Bone Man had started saying it different, less a joke now and more a nickname worn with something close to respect. He kept the ledger open on the kitchen table those days, columns filling with figures that would have seemed impossible to him a season ago, and some nights he'd sit with it under the lamp long after supper, running his finger down the numbers like he was tracing a map of ground he'd already walked, but still couldn't quite believe was his. Outside, the barrels waited under the lean-to, and inside the pot on the stove, another batch simmered low and slow, patient as everything else he'd built. The plant manager came out to the farm himself on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, driving a company truck that still smelled faintly of diesel and old blood, parking it careful in the yard like he wasn't sure the ground would hold him. He wore a clean shirt for the visit, which told the old man something before a word passed between them, because men who came to gloat didn't bother pressing their collars first. They stood by the fence a while, talking about nothing, the weather turning, the price of feed corn, until the manager finally got around to what he'd driven out to say, turning his hat in his hands the way nervous men do when they're about to ask for something they're not sure they deserve. He said the plant had scraps enough for 2 men doing what Sam was doing, maybe 3, and that if Sam wanted it, there was room to make it official, a standing arrangement, instead of the loose understanding they'd had, paperwork and a regular schedule, and a price that wouldn't need renegotiating every visit. He said it plain, no dressing on it, and when he was done he looked at the ground like a man waiting to be told no. But Sam didn't make him wait long. He said he'd take it, and shook the offered hand, and if there was any satisfaction in the exchange, it showed only in the small easing around his eyes. Nothing more. Nothing performed for an audience that wasn't there anyway. After the truck pulled out, he stood by the fence a good while longer, looking at the buckets stacked under the lean-to, thinking of the years those same buckets had sat empty against the plant's back wall, while smoke curled up from the burn pit, and nobody thought twice about what was going up with it. He thought of the widow who'd tasted the first sample at the feed store counter, and hadn't said a word for a long moment before her eyes went wet, and he thought of the fair, the line stretching past the barbecue smoke, faces he'd known his whole life standing there with paper cups in cold hands, waiting on something he'd made from what the town had been throwing away since before some of them were born. He went inside as the light started dropping gold across the yard, and he set a new pot on the stove out of old habit more than need, because the rhythm of it had become its own kind of peace, and some things a man kept doing long after the reason for doing them had already been answered. The ledger sat open on the table, waiting, and beyond the window the barrels stood in a neat row under the lean-to roof, more of them now than there'd ever been, more coming. He wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, the way he'd been taught long ago to log a supply count, and beside it he wrote a number that would have made the plant manager wince a year before. Barrels moving out, dollars moving in, none of it much by the standards of men who measured farms in acreage and machines, but enough. Enough to fix the fence line the bank had once threatened over, enough to buy a used stock trailer instead of borrowing one, enough that the young rancher who'd spread the story about the Bone Man losing his mind had come by one afternoon, hat in his hands, and asked, quiet, almost ashamed, if there was a way to get in on supplying trimmings from his own cattle. Sam had looked at him a long moment, the way he looked at weather before deciding whether to trust it, and then said there was always room for good stock, and left it at that. No lecture. No mention of the laughing outside the barn or the complaints about smell carried to town on a north wind. A man didn't need to be reminded of his mistake once he was standing in the middle of correcting it. The rendering plant's contract sat folded in the footlocker now, tucked beside the flag and the photographs. A strange thing to keep with those older, heavier memories, but it belonged there all the same. Another paper that said a promise had been kept, that nothing was thrown away if a man was willing to tend it. He stirred the pot slow, the way he always had, watching the surface go still and then move again, steam rising into the rafters where old harness leather hung forgotten, until he'd found new use for scraps of that too, mending what could be mended, letting go only of what truly couldn't. Outside, the light kept falling, turning the barrels gold, turning the fence rails gold, turning even the rust on the truck into something that looked, for a few minutes each evening, deliberate rather than worn. He thought of his wife, briefly, the way he did most evenings now without the old ache pulling at it. Just a thought, warm and passing, the kind a man could carry without it costing him anything. She would have laughed at the smell, he knew. She would have opened every window and complained for a week. And then she would have stood beside him at the fair, watching the line, saying nothing, because she'd always known before anyone else what he was capable of building from almost nothing. He ladled a cup for himself, sat on the step as the dark came on, and drank it slow, the way broth was meant to be taken, patient, unhurried, worth the wait.